I'll pass on the mic to the moderator, Drukthar Gyal.
Tsama teshtile tanda peke di siya siya tanda di nganso na jeton teslam gila pesha tanda ani tanda pere en primola nganso mixegi story changing ani gila ki kutsegi Dorjee tak jiwi thoni ya kutsi Dorjee tak tanda kutsi nyamyon to jiwi thoni ya nganso ki jangaya ta lecture tindi mambu chigore 아니 다다 Drukthar Gyal la zui nga수기 개와다 칠레바 아니 쉽게 참마 페샤 참마 제시인 아니 다나 좀 메시지 다다 그냥 직진에 케이게 가스텔라 주세 바지고 이렇게 삼남다다 네 어떻게 삼남다라 요래 그냥 거에 칠레 주세 바지 아디스에 단다 mansu mixegi ta maungbi nebab ki chashi di sowe kadula ani jusegi lambani lambani ta maungbi chana da tindegi korangi je chia da scenario planning nangi ta kejo soji da jusegi ki samnan maungbi chana de tie otun sama tigre sama tuchi shein. Okay, hello everyone, welcome to the youth forum, youth panel. We are going to discuss new generations or Tibetan youth view on the future of Tibet. So I'm Drukthar Gyal. I will be moderating this session. So it's not doubt. So our history, our culture, and survival is very important. And as we discussed, we are talking like in last several years, like last many years, we are talking more about the past. We're always like going back to past. Even last night we have discussion like down table, and like we are talking about future, but we always go past. So from like this panel discussion, also we try to talk more on the future. We should envision the future. So we are going to focus more on the like education, language, identity, displacement, migration, diaspora, inclusive, gentle environmental activism. So we try to cover like different aspects. So I'm so glad that we have like three dynamic Tibetan youth, Chemi Lhamo from Canada, Dorjee Lhamo from France, and Kunsel Rinchen from Netherlands. So let's start introduction. So I think it's better to introduce like all of myself. So I'm Drukthar Gyal, born in Tibet, went to TCB school, Gopalpur, and undergraduate from Delhi University in political science. My first master's in international relations and politics from University of Westminster, and my second master was from University of Edinburgh, Scotland, Chinese culture, and my focus was Chinese politics, especially from the opening and reform, like from like 1970s to 2019, especially start from the Deng Xiaoping era to Xi Jinping era. So I'm also the co-founder of SFT Westminster, and I was national director of SFT UK. Right now I'm hosting one podcast called the Intelligence Tibet podcast, and also called Group Talks. So it's mainly discussion on the like different things on the different issues of history, politics, current affairs, and all these things. Thank you. I will pass to Chemi Lhamo.
Hello everyone, my name is Chemi Lhamo. I'm a community organizer, a Tibetan activist or a human rights activist, and I recently ran for municipal office in Toronto for the city council candidate. We came in a tight second. I'll keep my brief introduction short. Thank you.
Dorjee Lhamo Hello everyone, my name is Dorjee Lhamo. I was born in Tibet and raised in India and also predominantly in France. I graduated from master's degree in international relations from Warwick University, which is in England. And yeah, that's it. Thank you.
My name is Kunsel Rinchen Dorjee. I'm 19 years old and I'm a second year student at Erasmus University. I study management of international social challenges, which is a very long name for public administration. I am active for Tibet I've been active for Tibet in various ways, and the most recent one is that we've started an SFT in Rotterdam. We just discussed our first event, and it was really, yeah, it was an amazing experience, so thank you.
So actually we have four panelists, and now we have only three. So we have like four Dynamic Tibetan youth here, so this morning we discussed about like three main like Tibetan diaspora and like what's happening in Tibet, imagination of future, and also we focus on the China's policy on Tibet. Let's start from the panel discussion. So we went back to what is happening in Tibet, what is the responsibilities, what are the hope and expectations of Tibetans inside Tibet to the outside of Tibet. And also we went through what the Tibetans outside expectation and hope of the Tibetans of inside, and we talk about the Tibetan language, colonialism, colonial boarding schools. We talk about the challenges in exile and how we need to tackle the democracy, elections, like the political power of His Holiness Dalai Lama and the future perspective of Tibet. And we talk about environment, we talk about so many things. Let's start from like Chemi Lhamo. So what is your take on the previous discussions?
Test 1, 2,口短。Yeah, thank you, Drukthar, for that question. I think the previous panels were phenomenal. We covered tons of topics. I think to be able to comment on everyone would be quite challenging. However, one thing that I think I took away was the reminder that I got for the Tibetan spirit inside of Tibet. How Damla and Senchop La talked about Tibetans inside of Tibet are constantly finding ways to know what's happening in exile or trying to find ways to get their information outside. Just this morning when I woke up, I was reading the news. There was a young Tibetan who was in prison for 5 years for possibly sending information to Europe. So that reminder, I think, is so important for us, especially young folks growing up in exile, about what's happening inside of Tibet. What is the current situation? And not only that, what are the young people doing inside of Tibet? To be able to have that connection. So that makes me go to the question that I have, which is, what are the points of connection that we have to Tibet? To Tibetans, to Tibet as a nation? What are the people in exile's points of connection? What are the information that we can get? And where is our sources of information? Is it a diverse? And for example, hearing from the speakers earlier this morning, I got to understand that how many efforts that they're putting inside of Tibet to be able to even have a common dialect. Because they don't speak the same dialect that we do in exile, right? We have a common dialect to some degree. But for them, they speak very different, distinct dialects, but they're still finding ways to come together despite the oppression constantly, to be able to speak the same dialect, to be able to discuss these important topics. For us, we already have that common dialect and also English in many ways to be able to communicate to each other. So how are we using these points of connections that we have to be able to build more and also learn more about what's happening inside of Tibet? So that's one of the main takeaways that I took, because it was a reminder of how much we need to do.
So thank you for this question, Drukthar. I think there were, as you said, phenomenal, interventions from the speakers from previous panels. But one specific intervention that kind of left a, lasting impression on me was Dr. Gyal's report on the residential schools, the boarding schools in Tibet, which is implemented by the Chinese government in an effort to actually exterminate and our culture and language, which is extremely saddening. We were aware that the Chinese main goal is to, I guess, completely destroy us in a way, but Dr. Gyal's intervention sort of reminded us that it's an alarming situation, and that in order to not counter but in an act of resistance, I think my takeaway is that I have this renewed realization of the importance of preserving our culture and language in exile when we have the actually means to do so, because our counterparts in Tibet, they don't have that luxury and that privilege. So I think we cannot take for granted the kind of access we have to actually practice it. So that's my main takeaway.
Thank you. I think in this entire morning, I've learned an enormous amount of new knowledge, especially since I honestly have quite limited knowledge on especially the situation inside of Tibet. And I think that kind of exemplifies also a sign of disconnect, which to me was very prominent, a sign of disconnect between the younger generation and the older generation, who often have these amazing, incredible experiences, stories to tell, which we often, due to language barriers or cultural barriers, cannot fully comprehend, which is an incredible pity. Yet also, when we engage with Tibetan youth, I've often noticed this rhetoric where we almost shift blame sometimes, where we use the word responsibility as if it's the favorite word in the Tibetan community when we talk about issues of political activism. The political youth, Tibetan youth, have to carry this responsibility, which can also produce counterproductive effects, because it can be a huge burden to actually be motivated to partake in Tibetan society and to partake in political activism. And to bridge this gap between the Tibetan younger generation and the older generation is, to me, incredibly important, and I feel like that's one of the main takeaways for me.
Think of that. So I want to I just want to stick the same topic. So I just want to start from the Chemi. I'm very sorry. So since especially after 2009, right? Large number of Tibetans inside Tibet, Tibetan students, Tibetan teachers, they started they came out on the road. They they began long march to preserve Tibetan language, to have language education and language systems in the schools and universities. It started from the long way, especially we can see from the 2009, from Labrang to Golok to Chongwon, Ngawa. It's everywhere. It started from there and then it goes everywhere. So my question is in the panel discussions, Sangye Gyal and all of the panelists mentioned that since the first day of invasions, they started destroy Tibetan language identity, assimilation Tibetan into Chinese. How we can challenge these tackles? So what kind of mindset, especially Tibetan people, the Tibetan children, Tibetan students inside, Tibetan youth inside, how they need to react on these issues?
Well, I'm not going to comment on the Tibetans inside of Tibet because I think they have full agency and they are constantly actually leading the way of how do we preserve, because that's the biggest source of inspiration that I find personally for myself, that the Tibetans inside of Tibet, the way they preserve the language and the culture despite the erasure. But for exile, especially the youth, I think we have the privilege of being able to be in a mindset of thriving. You know, many of our parents' generation, they were struggling to get food on our table to be able to just survive, or to get a piece of paper that says, here's a citizenship so you can belong to this country, right? So they've done the struggle of survival in many ways, if I were to speak generally. So for our generation, I love to call it our generation of thriving, right? They're the generation of survival, and now we've transitioned to the thriving. And so in our generation of thriving, we have the privilege and ability to spend some time to strategically think and look at stuff in terms of the trends. Not saying that our older generation didn't. They, I'm sure, did their part. But in terms of us and the abilities that we have, in terms of the capacity, one thing we need to do is recognize and acknowledge the types of strategies that the Chinese government use to be able to eradicate our culture, eradicate our identity, and that they're trying to do, right? What are the tactics that they're using? The tactics are, one of them is the schools, right? The colonial state-run boarding schools. But there's so many other tactics that they use, which is one of them, if I may point. The divides that we see in our community, it's not just happening naturally. I'm sure that the Chinese government is listening and constantly watching what are the ways that the Tibetan people in exile are starting to split. And then when they find all of these, so there's this, and then when they see these fractions happening, they go and invest in them, right? And not just within the Tibetan community, they're doing that at a larger scale in the world. They're looking at weak points that they see in different parts of society where they can enter. Take a look at the West. We have a lot of folks in the West who are left-leaning, progressive thought. A lot of progressive spaces nowadays are all pro-China and anti-America. Why is that? That's not happening out of nowhere. The Chinese government is funding a lot of these think tanks that seem to be very progressive, that say, oh yeah, Black Lives Matter, oh yeah, indigenous lives are very important, indigenous babies are very important. But if indigenous babies are so important, why are you having residential schools inside of Tibet? Right? Those questions need to be asked, but for that, we need to equip ourselves with the language, the strategies, and the tactics that they're using so that we can equip ourselves to be able to understand and use the narrative against them and point that hypocrisy. Right? How dare they talk about human rights and anti-imperialism if they themselves are a colonial body? But in order to call that out, one, we need to be in that space. But in order to enter that space, we need to do a lot of other things. And so how are we helping each other get into those spaces? And those are the questions that I usually ask. So thank you.
I think I'll start the second question with Dorjee Lhamo. So now we are talking more about what's happening in Tibet, like Drukthar Gyal and Tenzin Kunsel Rinchen, and many of the emphasizes what the policies, what the impacts, and what is the future like. So let's talk more about like what's happening in diaspora. So as a refugee, as an exile since like 1959, long way to go. So we, in the diaspora, we have like lots of challenges coming. We are migration from one place to another. We keep moving from one place to like Drukthar, right? So we have like effects from migration, displacement, and all these things. So we are getting lots of the problems inside Tibet, but at the same time we're getting lots of challenges for Tibetans, especially Tibetan youth who born in like the US, like Europe or the USA. So my question is, how do you envision like Tibetans' youth identity related to the future, to the migration and all this?
Well, it's a very tough question. I do not know if I'll be, actually deliver a satisfactory answer to this. But in my humble point of view, I think that our identity is, deeply linked to, I think, our language and our culture. That's something you cannot separate. If you want to discuss about the future of Tibet, well, when I envision a future Tibet, I see our language and history. That's something we cannot, dissociate. So there are challenges for sure on things that you've mentioned, but it might sound like I'm just repeating over and over again a lot of the arguments that are prevalent in our community. But I don't know, all the panels that we had today constantly reminded me that in the exile community we have the means and the means to actually implement and practice our language. The challenges are there for sure, but if you think in an individual basis, you can do that. If you take 5 minutes in your entire day to just write short sentences in Tibet, well, think about in 20 years the effort that you've put for 20 years. I think you'll able to get a huge caloric result. So, future of Tibet. What challenges? What can you do? Well, these are extremely caloric. It kind of scares, scary questions, right? What are you gonna do? And especially when elders say, when we hear about that, I'm like, yes, but it's such a huge burden and responsibility, as Kunsela said. But instead of nurture us with this kind of discourse, I think it would be much better to say, let's walk this path together. We will guide you in the leadership, but let's do it together instead of just dividing and be like, oh, you guys have to do this. This is not really encouraging for the youth. I think that's why they're kind of afraid to actually come into these sort of platforms and stuff. So please, I urge the elders in our community to kind of dissociate from this kind of discourse and be more encouraging and more inclusive about it. Because there's so many things that can be done when we stand united. That's what I wanted to say. I don't know if I've answered your question, but yeah.
So you can continue, but I want to. Yeah. Okay. But you can
Sure.
say same thing, but you can you talk more on the activism after this statement? You can continue.
On activism.
But I think you can speak to displacement and identity as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think we'll talk about both.
It's both. Yeah.
I think we have a lot of issues to tackle. Firstly, very shortly about Tibetan identity. I feel like Tibetan identity is ever changing. It's constantly moving, and characteristics that we view as an integral part of our Tibetan identity, where before we became in exile, were not even a part of our Tibetan identity. And we've created several constructs which we view now as completely necessary to our movement, yet they've only been created after 1959. And therefore, I believe, of course, language is incredibly important, integral part of our culture, yet there are so many facets of the Tibetan identity. And if one person has 4 out of 5, one person has 3 out of 5, it doesn't matter, because Tibetan identity is very personal to each and everyone. And when it becomes a divisionary or exclusionary way or narrative talking about identity, it will only create more of a disconnected community, rather which can be something as a united element. And regarding migration, because that was one of the main points, we have this huge migration flow, coming from India, Java to the west, and Tibetan youth as well are kind of dispersing over so many different countries. And this has an incredible effect on our movement, because when we become more disconnected and more also kind of isolated from the Tibetan community, it becomes also very difficult to engage with Tibetan activism. And especially with whether, with barriers to entry. For example, whether that barrier could be language or distance even, just me being in a city far away from Amsterdam where our Tibetan community is settled. I live in Nijmegen, and it's quite a distance to go there every time. And that was also one of the barriers, or maybe cultural differences. And irrespective of these barriers to entry, it can be also amplified by this feeling of non-identification, where you might feel your identity, or you might identify as being Tibetan. You might not identify or not feel as fully engaged with the Tibetan community. And especially with this huge migration flow, this can become more of an issue where people, or Tibetan youth, can feel less engaged or connected with their Tibetan community. And yet Tibetan communities are often the base of grassroots organizing, and grassroots organizing is of course the base of Tibetan activism. So I think this is one of the huge challenges that we all have to face.
Yeah. So let's go to the activism, right? So we have Kunsel is the founder of SFT Rotterdam, right? And Chemi Lhamo, you all know, she's an activist, and Chemi Lhamo also calls people who were born after 1959 is born as an activist. So, but in our society, there's complex conflict issues on the activist things and the policies we are going. So since the dialogue started between the Beijing and Dharamsala, they have a talk. So let's focus more on the dialogues, and at the same time we I don't know how to say, but let's try to not do very active the violence active things against the activism there. So since last many years, there's debating inside the youth, and not only youth, in Tibetan diaspora. So do we need to go on the activism as happened for last many years, or do we still need to create an environment for the better conversation, dialogue, negotiation with Chinese? So let's start from Kunsel. So as you are activist, right? So you are activist. At the same time, you are SFT founder. Why do you think activism, especially Tibetan youth activism to the Tibetan movement, is essential, important?
Thank you for that question. I think I'm going to keep it very small and personal to the reason why we founded SFT Rotterdam. And it's a chapter for a reason. It's not a national network. Although national networks are incredibly important to our movement to really set up these campaigns and organizing, we did not have any type of infrastructure ready in the Netherlands to tackle such campaigns. And our main focus is simply raising awareness, is simply engaging with Tibetan youth, but also non-Tibetan students who want to feel engaged with grassroots organizing. And it's rather about a very personal, what can I do personally to just raise awareness about Tibet? And I believe that organizing huge campaigns is incredibly important. Honestly, for us, we've just started. We are not able to fully probably make use of the resources available, since it's such a difficult challenge to suddenly start up a campaign. So that's why what we're trying to do is simply supporting bigger campaigns, which, for example, as Chemi Lhamo is able, to kind of endorse, or is able to have this think tank, and we would more be on the ground, trying to petition, trying to raise awareness, and really get those individual interactions. I think that would kind of sum up how we started SFT and the reason why.
Drukthar question made me think about activism in a different way than I generally think about, because For me, activism, I think I rooted in the word act. Like you're physically, or not necessarily physically, but mentally, emotionally, spiritually, however it is, but you're acting, right? And there's a saying of, yes, every Tibetan born after 1959 is born an activist, but as someone mentioned yesterday, it's also to act on it, right? And I think your mere existence, the fact that you're alive, the fact that you say, I'm a Tibetan, or I have a Tibetan name, my Yemi Dinzi, your existence is resistance. The Chinese government is constantly trying to eradicate our identity, but the fact that you exist, and even if you do not speak any Tibetan, the fact that you introduce somebody and say, my name is Pande, that in itself for me is also part of your activism. And so, how do you go beyond that is, again, being able to recognize the nuances and ways how you can play a role in the movement, the larger movement. So it was really nice to hear Kunsel's experience with her chapter. Still, every single one of us have our own stories, right? And the fact that we contribute to this larger Tibetan identity, what is our role in the movement is a question to be asked, right? And our role in the movement can be only understood, and it's of course constantly changing, but it can only be understood when you understand yourself. What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? What are things that you want to work on? If you want to work on your Tibetan language, you can work towards it. If you want to work towards understanding Buddhist philosophy and the way it connects to neuroscience and psychology, so be it. It can be in any way possible, but you need to connect to the movement in the ways that you connect with yourself, right? And so there's that work to be done. And so for me, it's not really necessarily separate when we have activism and other types of, lobbying efforts with government relationships. Because for me, when I say I'm an activist, I do all of it. I want to go to governments, I want to lobby them, I want to tell them as a Canadian citizen what I think the Canadian government should be doing. That's one. But then there's also aspects of me doing haka. Every Wednesday, I made my own commitment to be wearing, or at least trying my best to eat at a Tibetan restaurant or wear Tibetan clothes. And so there are various ways that you can become an activist or be part of a larger movement, and that's for you to define. And then even in the Western concepts of advocacy, there are various roles an activist plays. I think there's also circles of activist role that they explain. There's one aspect of it that talks about being a reformer, which means that you enter the systems of power to be able to change the way the oppressor, oppresses the people, right? And so hopefully not even oppress, period, but right now the current systems work in a way that they oppress the oppressed. And so how do we change that as an activist that goes into the system? And that's still defined as an activist, a reformer. And in external ways, it can be seen as a politician, right? But internally, you know what you're doing. And so that's defined by you, and I don't think anybody can take that away from you.
I wholeheartedly, with what Chemi Lhamo has said, I think it was really important to include other, aspects and other definitions of activism. And I'll just, say one additional thing. I think it's a very personal approach to there's a very personal approach to activism. Yes, of course, we go to, protest every, the Sumju Tuje. Yes, we do that every year, but then when we get back to our home, what are the efforts that you can do on an individual basis and on a long-term basis that could link to activism, as you said? Well, the main point is that it's, I think, important to find something that you can connect with Tibet, whether if it's learning, reading Tibetan literature, or just as you said, learning about Buddhist philosophy and then going on to research about the connection with the neuroscience and everything. But the main point is to stay consistent and have a long-term approach to it, because if we don't maintain that, then so I think in every work or in every sort of kind of
Initiative?
Yeah, any initiative that you take on an individual basis, I think it's good to be ambitious, but I think it's extremely also important to stick to realizable, feasible, I think, objectives. And that way, I think it's also important to stay realistic and have like a more like a long-term approach and keep it extremely personal. I think that's how you can actually go onward and forever. Thank you.
Thank you. My next question. So, like, what are the challenges Tibetan youth face in general, and which leads to the uncertainty feature of Tibet? So, like, there are lots of challenges. We are discussing language, like some certain language, like identity crisis, certain things. But like, can you say one challenge, things one or two challenges which face it's not only Tibetan youth, in the future, uncertainty of the future of Tibet.
Because you said to mention a challenge that Tibetan youth face that would lead to an uncertainty. Well, lots of uncertainties to mention. However, one challenge I definitely think is if the Tibetan youth lose hope in our central government. The central government is key to the existence of the Tibetan exiles. And the way I see it personally at the moment is a lot of disconnect. And we've been talking about disconnections and connections that need to be made, right? And disconnections to be eradicated. So if the Tibetan youth no longer see the central government as vital as it is and the role that it plays, how do we, that worries me. And so it's very important, in my opinion, that we continue to build. And I think earlier speakers mentioned many times that this democracy, yes, in many ways is a wonderful gift that was passed on to us that we didn't necessarily have to fight and have bloodshed and tears done for to be able to achieve it. But it's still very precious. And democracy is in the fall in every other part of the world. Just recently I was in Lithuania. There was over 40 countries that were talking about autocracies, dictatorships in their countries. And these are thought leaders, world leaders. And so if they're talking about the fall of democracy, for us, we've been in this game for so long. And so if we have a democracy in exile that's without borders, so unique, it's something that we need to treasure. And if there's things wrong with it, we need to feel responsible or have the onus to fix it, because it is ours. It's not just something that's alien. And so I really reflect again from your first question of how do we have ownership of it? If that's an uncertainty or a fear that we have, then how do we regain our trust? How can we, as the young people, do our little bit to understand the system better? And then so that we can, improve it. I think the charter was brought up this morning as well, and it's like, how many of us have read it? How many of us know how it operates? How many of us watch the sessions? Are they accessible? If they're not, how can we ask them to be more accessible? So those are questions that I would ask.
I think because Chemi Lhamo very carefully explained the broader kind of movement, just more on an individual level, challenges Tibetan youth face would be, for example, feeling not confident enough, not confident in their ability to speak about the Tibetan cause, about the Tibetan movement. For example, I know a lot of Tibetan youth who I've talked with, especially when they're 14, 15, and they feel discouraged by their environment. Since there's such a lack of Tibetans in their environment, they feel often discouraged talking about the Tibetan cause and Tibetan movement, which makes them move away even more from our community. And therefore, I believe it's also incredibly important to, for example, equip them with just very simple 1 minute, how do I deliver a Tibetan cause or the Tibetan movement? How do I explain that to my friends in just 1 minute? Because often we can feel so scared to talk about our Tibetan movement or cause because it's such a huge, there's so many things you want to tackle. Environmental activism, you want to tackle, how we have a Tibetan government in exile, how do you explain that when you're 14 to your friends? It's incredibly difficult and challenging. And therefore I feel like we need to set up a certain type of framework for these Tibetan youth, growing up in exile in the West as well, and how do I tackle these issues? How do I, for example, set up a presentation to go talk to my teacher? Just very basic things, which is very easy to say as maybe a parent, oh, why don't you go talk a speech, to give a speech at your high school? And then you're just as a kid singing like, what? How am I able to suddenly give a presentation about Tibet, but it's so big, it's so broad. So I feel like we should kind of give them these handles, to tackle Tibet in very tangible, concrete, straight to the point ways. And especially because those type of small kind of achievements of like giving a presentation about Tibet can do so much for your simshuk. It can do so much for your feeling of I am creating something and I am helping the Tibetan movement and cause, even just on a very micro level. So I feel like there should be more emphasis on creating facilities for these Tibetan youth when they engage with, for example, Western communities and high schools as well. Yeah.
Thank you. So I have like 3 questions here, but I prefer to take like 2-3 questions from our audience.